All right, chapter 24 by Winston Chiong is there cannot be agreement as to what constitutes human death against definitions, necessary and sufficient conditions, and determinate boundaries. So here, in his introduction, he says, a theoretical framework for debates about death that has become widely accepted is what people look for and what they've often found in the writings of Burnett and his Dartmouth colleagues. However, he's summarizing this, saying that, look, according to them, debates should begin with a definition that captures the shared and implicit understanding that we associate with the word death. Then, on the basis of the definition, arrive at a criterion that gives necessary and sufficient conditions for death in human beings. And Burnett also claims that it's always a determinate matter of fact whether or not someone does or does not satisfy this criterion. So, Chiong says, while some authors accept this theoretical framework, but reject the whole brain criterion of death, I reject the framework itself. Interestingly, he actually likes the whole brain criterion of death, but he rejects the framework that leads to it. First, he says, I reject the claim that we should start by attempting to define or analyze the ordinary meaning of the word death. Okay. Secondly, I don't think there's a unique set of necessary and sufficient conditions shared by all dead people in virtue of which they are all dead. And finally, I'm going to reject the idea that there's always a determinate matter of fact whether someone is alive or dead. All right. Interestingly, Burnett and Chiong both accept that the sense of death relevant here is the biological death of a human organism. One last point of introduction. Chiong says, I want to say that many of my arguments here are not novel. There's not that much new stuff. I'm just packaging it in a way that I think presents it better for this particular type of example. Okay, so 3 examples of death. Consider 3 different legal declarations of death, all quite different, though all in accordance with existing law and accepted medical practice in the U.S. In the first case, what we've got is a person who dies in his sleep at home, and he's found the next morning and is pronounced dead, okay, just by the physician checking his pulse. Now, in the second case, a woman falls to the ground and is brought to the ER in a coma, and she's got a lot of tests run on her. Turns out that she doesn't have any brain functioning. And what's the difference between these 2 cases? Even though the woman's heart is beating in the second case. Okay. In the first case, the physician determines that the man has died on the basis of the traditional circulatory respiratory criterion, or cardiopulmonary criterion, same thing. However, in the second case, the physicians determine that the woman has died on the basis of the modern whole brain criterion of death. Now, how are you going to make sense of this? Well, one way, a common way of reconciling these 2 cases is to say that, well, the whole brain criterion of death is actually the correct one, but the circulatory respiratory criterion is merely acceptable as a rough approximation in certain cases. However, says Chiong, this explanation, this common explanation, does not really account for a third case. The third case is donation after cardiac death, which has become an increasingly common practice over the last decade. Okay, and so he imagines a man who has ALS, and the guy wants to donate his organs before he leaves this earth, and so he arranges with his doctors for, after his ventilator being stopped, the lack of oxygen and accumulation of CO2 is going to cause his heart to stop beating about half an hour. However, because his organs are still in good shape, he wants to be an organ donor. So he basically, if you read this case, you can see after waiting for a pre-specified interval of 5 minutes, his physicians determine that his heart has permanently stopped beating, and they pronounce him dead on the basis of the permanent loss of circulation and breathing. Okay? And then his organs can be used for transplantation. That's why it's called donation after cardiac death. Now, in this case, this third case, we cannot claim that the circulatory respiratory criterion is merely used as a low-tech approximation of the whole brain criterion. Why? Because this death takes place in one of the most technologically sophisticated settings in modern medicine. If we really believe, says Chiong, that the whole brain criterion is the precise account of when someone has died, then we should regard the application of the circulatory respiratory criterion in this third case as a sham. Why? Because it leaves open the possibility that some brain functions persist, and therefore that, according to the whole brain criterion, the patient is still alive. So in these CDC cases of controlled cardiac donation controlled donation after cardiac death, the worry is if you accept the whole brain criterion, you might be taking organs from a living person. In this chapter, however, Chiong is going to propose a different way of understanding this differences or heterogeneity in our practices of determining death. Okay? And he summarizes his view. So what are the parts of this? Well, his section on definitions, criteria, and biological kinds says, look, there is a model for thinking about this that Bernat is using, but it's a model of making your theories in a way that is called conceptual analysis, developed by a group of famous philosophers. But such an analysis, says Chiong, does more than just indicate whether or not something, say, is a bachelor. Rather, such a conceptual analysis tells us what it is to be a bachelor. That is, it tells us what features all bachelors have in common, in virtue of which they are bachelors. While this kind of model of conceptual analysis is intuitively appealing for some terms in our language, like bachelor, it breaks down when we consider terms that refer to natural kinds. Okay, gold, tiger, so on. One important feature of natural kinds is that they have an underlying nature. For instance, there is a necessary and sufficient condition, Chiong tells us, for something to be gold, which is having atomic number 79. Now here, I should tell you, we're wading into some important philosophy of language that is kind of controversial, so welcome to the controversy. Then, says Chiong, consider the next step in Bernat's model, which is to look for a criterion that gives necessary and sufficient conditions for death. Okay, in the case of some natural kinds, Chiong says, like gold, necessary and sufficient conditions for membership in the kind do exist. However, biological kinds, not chemical kinds, but biological kinds typically do not have such necessary and sufficient conditions. And as his example, Chiong runs through the idea of tigers. Is there a way of coming up with a necessary and sufficient condition for a tiger, kind of like there is for gold? And he argues, well, we could start by saying that our shared implicit understanding of tigers includes that they're large, predatory, four-legged, have black and orange stripes, and live in Africa and Asia. However, he says we can easily imagine mutant or damaged tigers that are not large, or not predatory, or not four-legged, or do not have black and orange stripes, or do not live in Africa or Asia. Okay. Also, we can imagine other things that do have these properties, right? So, well, might we turn to scientific investigation of tigers? Instead of just looking at phenotypes, could we look at a more scientifically sophisticated analysis to find out the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a tiger? Chiong says, well, no. It's clear there's not a tiger gene that all tigers have in common, in virtue of which they are all tigers. And even if you look at the whole genome, when we broaden our view to encompass the entire genome of an organism, there's of course no sequence of base pairs that all tigers have in common that makes them all tigers. Okay, so the broader point here is that natural kinds in biology, unlike natural kinds in physics or chemistry, encompass populations that exhibit tremendous genetic and phenotypic diversity. Okay? As a final point, recall that Bernat claims that it's always a determinate matter of fact whether or not something is alive or dead. However, says Chiong, biological natural kinds typically admit of borderline cases in which it is unclear whether or not something belongs to the relevant kind. Okay, he gives an example from the debates about the nature of biological species. Okay, what about life and death? Could you think of those as biological natural kinds? What remains at issue between Bernat and Chiong is whether the terms life and death are more like the term tiger or more like the term bachelor. Okay, so let's begin by considering whether we can find a definition of life or death that captures the indispensable characteristics that comprise our implicit, consensually agreed upon understanding of life and death. He doesn't think we can. As an illustration, imagine meeting someone like Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, who insists on defining the word bachelor not as an unmarried male person, but instead as a nice knockdown argument. What? You might be thinking. His example here is supposed to show what it's like to have a conversation where you're totally talking past somebody. Burnett claims that the word death also has an analytic definition, which is the permanent cessation of the critical functions of the organism as a whole. Okay? However, one initial ground for doubt is simply that some of the terms that he uses in this definition have really precise technical meanings that ordinary speakers often don't have in mind. Further, says Chiong, if we were to ask people to state their implicit concept of death, we'd probably find a lot more variation than agreement. The problem here, says Chiong, is not just that people disagree, but the real problem for Burnett's model is that it seems to make genuine disagreement impossible. It turns into something like the Humpty Dumpty case. So, contrary to Burnett and his colleagues' model, there is no analytic definition of death that makes explicit the indispensable characteristics of death by analyzing our implicit and shared concept of death. That particular strategy is just not going to work, says Chiong. Now, contrary to Burnett's claims, he says there is also no unique set of features that's both necessary and sufficient for death. And, contrary to Burnett's claims, life and death, like the natural kind tiger, admit of borderline cases, in which no rational or scientific considerations can dictate whether we should classify something as living or dead. Now, he's talked about this in some other paper, but he's going to summarize it here. To see a gist of the kind of argument saying that there's not these things, we might start by taking a step back and we might ask, why? Why have the theorists' efforts to provide necessary and sufficient conditions for death proven to be so unsatisfying? Well, take two cases. First is the case of whole brain criterion that Burnett favors. Burnett says the only functions of the whole brain that are relevant to determining whether someone is alive or dead. Other bodily functions are not relevant. But then, you run into cases presented by Schumann. It's an unusual case of whole brain death, where you've got a pregnant woman who's able to keep a fetus alive inside of her if the life support system is hooked up to the pregnant woman's body. Don't you want to say that she's still alive and not dead? On the other hand, consider the traditional, circulatory respiratory function favored by folks like Schumann. You can provide some possible counterexamples to that, too. In both cases, says Chiong, the attempt to provide strict necessary and sufficient conditions for death has left us with impoverished accounts of life and death that force us to ignore important features of individual cases. Now, his own view, Chiong's own view, is that a cluster account is best. A cluster account of life and death does not attempt to state necessary and sufficient conditions for life and death. Rather, a cluster account recognizes a variety of features that may be relevant to the determination that an individual organism is alive or dead. Okay, here he lists like 6 or 7 different ones. It's not like the list of features that define bachelorhood. It's not like you've got to have all of these or you don't have the concept. Now, this leaves us with the practical problem of what are we going to do in borderline or intermediate cases. One solution is to adopt an artificially defined boundary for legal and social purposes. And he says, while the whole brain criterion represents one acceptable boundary, there are other cutoffs that we could choose to adopt in certain circumstances or for special purposes.